Story 1. I never imagined I'd find myself in a place like Dustbin, and certainly not driving one of its cabs through the empty streets after midnight. But a man will do strange things when he's desperate. My last paycheck had been gone for 3 weeks, and the rent was already late. My phone buzzed with messages I couldn't bring myself to read. My sister needed help with her medical bills. My landlord was threatening to evict me, and the temporary jobs in Houston had all dried up. I'd pawned my watch, sold my guitar, and skipped so many meals I'd had to punch a new hole in my belt. So when I saw the flyer tacked on the gas station, bulletin board, night drivers needed, no experience necessary, cash paid daily, I called the number without even thinking. Dustbin sits on the very edge of nowhere. It's just a flat stretch of Texas scrubland that feels like it goes on forever. The population is 12,000, but I'd swear half of them are ghosts or close to it. The main street is a faded strip of shuttered shops and weathered brick. It's the kind of place where the only neon left flickers outside the all-night diner. The rest of the town sprawls out in tired ranch houses and W-wides, pressed right up against fields that hum with insects in the summer and stand completely silent in the winter. At night, the wind picks up dust and old secrets, rattling the windows and carrying the far-off howl of coyotes. The cab company was a squat building at the edge of town, its sign only half lit and buzzing. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. The manager, a wiry man named Earl, looked me up and down with eyes that had seen too many nights. He handed me a battered clipboard and a set of keys, then slid a sheet of paper across the counter. "These are the rules," he said, his voice as flat as the land outside. "You follow them, you'll do fine. Break them, and you're on your own." I glanced at the list. The rules were handwritten in blocky letters, the ink smudged in places. Don't pick up anyone standing at the crossroads after midnight. Don't look in the rearview mirror between 2:13 and 2:27 a.m. Never leave the cab running and empty, not even for a second. If a passenger pays with a coin-stamped Dustbin fare, refuse it and drive away. I tried to laugh, but Earl didn't smile. "You'll want to remember those," he said. "Dustbin's got its own way of doing things." I needed the money, so I nodded, and signed my name at the bottom of the page. Earl handed me a faded yellow cab key and pointed to the lot out back. The car was older than I was, a Crown Victoria with a cracked dashboard and a faint smell of gasoline. The radio only picked up to stations, country and static, but the heater worked, and that was enough. I settled into the driver's seat, checked the meter and waited for my first call. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, low and tired. "Cab 7, you copy?" "Yeah, I'm here," I said, trying to sound like I'd done this before. "Pick up at the corner of Main and Willow. Name's Mrs. Harov. She'll be waiting." The streets were empty as I drove, the headlights carving tunnels through the dark. Porch lights glowed behind drawn curtains, and the only movement was the slow drift of tumbleweeds across the road. I kept one eye on the clock, the other on the crossroads as I passed them. Midnight had come and gone, and the intersections looked the same as any other, but the rules pressed at the back of my mind. Mrs. Hargrove was waiting on the curb, wrapped in a thick shawl. She climbed in without a word, settling into the back seat with a sigh. Her eyes met mine in the rear view, and, for a moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. I remembered the second rule and looked away. "Where to, ma'am?" I asked. She gave me an address on the far side of town near the old grain silos. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional tap of her fingernails on the door. When we arrived, she handed me a crumpled bill and slipped out into the dark, her footsteps fading into the dust. The next fare was a young man in a faded baseball cap waiting outside the 24-hour laundromat. He climbed in, eyes darting nervously. "Just drive," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. I kept my questions to myself and took him where he asked, dropping him off at a trailer park on the edge of town. He paid in cash, but as he stepped out, something clinked on the seat. I reached back and found a coin, heavy in gold, stamped with the words, "Dustbin fare." My fingers tingled as I remembered the rule. I set the coin on the dashboard and watched as the man disappeared into the night. I didn't touch it again. The hours crawled by, the radio silent except for the dispatcher's occasional check-in. I picked up a woman with a suitcase at the bus station, a pair of teenagers from the diner, a man in a suit who never spoke a word. Each ride was a study, in silence, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you wonder what people are running from. At 2:10 a.m., I glanced at the clock and felt my heart skip. The rearview mirror loomed above me, reflecting the empty back seat. I kept my eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel. The minutes ticked by, slow and heavy. At 2:13, the air in the cab grew thick, the heater sputtering as if the night itself had grown colder. I heard a whisper, soft and low, but I didn't turn around. I focused on the lines of the road, counting the seconds until 2:27 when the time passed. The air cleared and the heater hummed back to life. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My last fare of the night was an old man waiting. By the crossroads, he waved as I approached, both hands raised high. The rules flashed in my mind, and I slowed the car, heart pounding. Midnight was long past, and the crossroads stretched out in every direction, empty except for the old man and the dust swirling around his boots. I kept driving. The old man's smile faded as I passed, his eyes following me until I turned the corner, and he was swallowed by the dark. The sun was rising by the time I pulled back into the cab company lot. Earl was waiting, leaning against the door with a mug of coffee in his hand. "How'd it go?" he asked. I handed him the keys, my hands shaking. I followed the rules. Earl nodded, the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. "That's all you can do." I walked home through the empty streets, the sky turning pink above the fields. Dust pine felt different in the daylight, but the shadows lingered at the edges, waiting for night to fall again. I told myself it was just a job, just another way to keep the lights on. But as I crawled into bed, the rules echoed in my mind, and I wondered what would happen if I ever broke them. Story 2. The next night, dust pine felt even emptier. The air was thick with the kind of heat that settles in your bones and makes you sweat. Even with the windows down, I'd slept badly, haunted by dreams of the old man at the crossroads and the coin-stamped dust pine fare glinting on my dashboard. I woke up tangled in my sheets, the rules echoing in my mind like a warning I couldn't shake. I walked to the cab company just before sundown, boots crunching over gravel. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you're the last person left alive. Main Street was empty, except for a stray dog nosing around a trash can and a couple of old men playing dominoes outside the barber shop, their laughter swallowed by the heat. Earl was waiting for me in the office, leaning back in his chair with a mug of coffee balanced on his knee. He didn't say much, just handed me the keys and nodded toward the lot. The same battered Crown Vic sat waiting, its yellow paint faded to the color of old parchment. I slid behind the wheel, the seat still warm from the day, and started the engine. The first hour passed in a haze of nothing. I drove the length of Main Street twice, circled the trailer parks, and waited outside the grocery store. The radio crackled with static, the dispatcher's voice drifting in and out like a ghost. I watched the sun slip behind the horizon, the sky turning the color of bruised peaches, and tried not to think about the rules. My first fare was a woman in a red dress, standing outside the liquor store with a paper bag clutched to her chest. She got in without a word, her perfume filling the cab with the scent of cheap flowers. She gave me an address near the edge of town, her voice flat and tired. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires on the cracked pavement. I caught her watching me in the rear view, her eyes dark and unreadable. I remembered the second rule and forced myself to look away, focusing on the road ahead. When we reached her stop, she handed me a $5 and slipped out, her footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. I watched her disappear into the darkness, the red of her dress swallowed by the night. The next call came from the dispatcher, a pickup at the old gas station out by the highway. The place was half lit, the pumps long dead, the sign swinging in the breeze. A man stood by the payphone, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He climbed in, his boots leaving dust on the floor mats. "Crossroads and Pine," he said, voice rough as gravel. I hesitated. Crossroads, the word stuck in my mind, sharp as a thorn. I checked the clock. It was just after midnight. The rule flashed in my head: don't pick up anyone standing at the crossroads after midnight. But he was already in the car, the door shut behind him. My mouth went dry and I gripped the wheel tighter. We drove in silence, the headlights carving tunnels through the dark. I tried not to look at him in the mirror, tried not to think about the rules or the stories I'd heard as a kid. Stories about things that waited at crossroads, about bargains made and souls lost. When we reached the intersection, he leaned forward, breath hot on my neck. "Let me out here," he said. I stopped the car, hands shaking. He got out without another word, disappearing into the shadows between the streetlights. I watched him go, heart pounding, and told myself it was just a man, just another fare. But when I looked back at the seat, there was a smear of dust in the shape of a handprint, and the air smelled like burnt matches. I drove back to town, nerves frayed. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, calling for another pickup. This time it was at the diner, a pair of teenagers in hoodies, laughing too loud, their eyes glossy with exhaustion. They piled into the back seat, talking over each other, their words tumbling out in a rush. "Did you hear about the guy who disappeared last week?" one of them asked, voice pitched high with excitement. "Yeah, my cousin said he was last seen near the old mill," the other replied. "Said he got in a cab and never came home." They looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I forced a smile and kept driving, the rules pressing at the back of my mind. "Is it true what they say?" the first one asked. "About the rules," I shrugged. "Just stories," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. They laughed, but it was a nervous kind of laughter, the kind that fills the space where fear should be. When I dropped them off, they paid in cash and ran inside, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting something to follow. The night dragged on, the town growing quieter with each passing hour. I picked up a man in a suit who smelled of sweat and desperation, a woman with a baby who wouldn't stop crying, an old couple who argued the whole way home. Each ride was a reminder of how thin the line was between normal and strange, between safe and something else. At 2:09 a.m., I found myself parked outside the laundromat, the clock ticking closer to the time I dreaded most. The rearview mirror loomed above me, reflecting the empty back seat. I stared at the dashboard, counting the minutes, my hands slick with sweat. At 2:13, the air in the cab shifted, the street lights flickered, and the radio hissed with static. I heard a voice, soft and distant, whispering my name. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The whisper grew louder, filling the cab with the sound of my own name, repeated over and over. I fought the urge to look in the mirror to see who or what was sitting behind me. The rules echoed in my mind. Don't look in the rear view between 2:13 and 2:27 a.m. The minutes crawled by, each second stretching into eternity. My heart hammered in my chest, sweat dripping down my spine. The whisper faded, replaced by a cold silence that pressed in from all sides. At 2:27, the clock ticked over and the air cleared. The radio snapped back to life. The streetlights steadied, and I let out a shaky breath. I pulled into the lot behind the cab company, hands trembling. Earl was waiting, smoking a cigarette in the shadows. "You look like hell," he said, flicking ash onto the ground. "Long night," I replied, voice barely. Above a whisper, he nodded, eyes narrowing. "You follow the rules." I nodded, came close though. He took a drag, exhaled smoke into the night. "That's how it starts," he said. "You get comfortable, start thinking the rules are just stories. That's when it gets you." I wanted to ask what it was, but the words stuck in my throat. Earl finished his cigarette and ground it out beneath his boot. "Go home," he said. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you'll be worse." I walked home through the empty streets, the heat of the day lingering in the air. Dustpine felt different now. The shadows deeper, the silence heavier. I passed the crossroads and shivered, remembering the man in the hat and the smell of burnt matches. When I reached my apartment, I found a coin on the doormat, heavy and gold, stamped with Dustpine Fair. I left it where it was, stepped over it, and locked the door behind me. I lay awake for hours, the rules running through my mind like a prayer. Don't pick up anyone at the crossroads after midnight. Don't look in the rear view between 2:13 and 2:27 a.m. Never leave the cab running and empty. If a passenger pays with a coin stamped Dustpine Fair, refuse and drive away. I wondered how many drivers before me had broken the rules. How many had disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard a whisper outside my window, soft and low, calling my name. I pulled the covers over my head and prayed for morning. Story 3. The third night crept in with a heaviness that pressed against my chest from the moment I left my apartment. The heat had broken, replaced by a restless wind that rattled the loose siding on the buildings and carried with it the scent of distant rain. Dustpine streets seemed to shrink in the darkness, the neon sign outside the diner flickering like a dying firefly. I felt the weight of the rules more than ever, each one a stone in my pocket, dragging me down as I made my way to the cab company. Earl was waiting outside, smoking in the glow of the porch light, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. He didn't say much, just handed me the keys and nodded toward the lot. I wondered if he slept at all, or if he simply waited for drivers to come and go, counting heads at dawn. The Crown Vic was where I left it, the only constant in a town that felt more unreal with each passing night. I started the engine, the familiar rumbles settling my nerves for a moment. The radio was nothing but static, the dispatcher's voice lost somewhere between frequencies. I rolled down the window and let the wind in, hoping it would clear my head. The first call came just after midnight, a woman waiting at the edge of town near the old cattle pens. She stood alone beneath a broken streetlight, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. As I pulled up, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. She climbed in without a word, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Where to? I asked, my voice too loud in the silence. She gave me an address I didn't recognize, somewhere out past the grain silos where the town gave way to endless fields. I nodded and pulled away, the headlights barely piercing the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires on the cracked road. I glanced at her in the mirror, careful to keep my eyes from lingering too long. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. I wanted to ask if she was all right, if she needed help, but something in her posture warned me off. When we reached her stop, she pressed a crumpled bill into my hand had slipped out into the night. I watched her walk toward a house with no lights in the windows, her figure swallowed by the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing by the porch, but when I blinked, the shape was gone. The next fare was a call from the dispatcher, his voice clearer than before. Cab 7, you copy? Got a pickup at the old feed store. Says he's in a hurry. The feed store was a squat building on the edge of town, its windows boarded up, the sign faded to nothing. A man stood beneath the awning, his suit to clean, his shoes shining in the dust. He got in, nodding politely, and gave me an address on the far side of town. As we drove, he hummed a tune I didn't recognize, tapping his fingers on the armrest in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I tried to focus on the road, but the sound wormed its way into my head, growing louder with each mile. I glanced at the clock. 2:05 a.m. He stopped humming as we approached a crossroads, his gaze fixed on the intersection. You ever hear the stories about this place? He asked, his voice low. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. He smiled, teeth to white in the dim light. They say if you wait here long enough, something will come for you. Something old, something hungry. I gripped the wheel tighter, the rules screaming in my mind. Don't pick up anyone standing at the crossroads after midnight. I pressed the gas a little harder, eager to leave the intersection behind. He laughed softly, the sound echoing in the empty cab. You're smart to keep moving, he said. Not everyone remembers the rules. When we reached his stop, he handed me a coin-heavy, gold, stamped with dustpine fare. My stomach twisted. I pushed it back into his hand, shaking my head. He smiled again, slipping the coin into his pocket. Suit yourself, he said. Stepping out into the night, the wind picked up as I drove back toward town, the sky flickering with distant lightning. The radio hissed with static, the dispatcher's voice lost in the noise. I felt a pressure building in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. At 2:12 a.m., I pulled over by the laundromat, hands shaking. The clock ticked over to 2:13, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The rearview mirror loomed above me, reflecting the empty back seat. I kept my eyes fixed on the dashboard, counting the seconds. The air in the cab grew cold, the heater sputtering. I heard a whisper, soft and insistent, my name repeated over and over. I fought the urge to look, to see who or what was sitting behind me, The rules pressed against my mind, a barrier between me and whatever waited in the darkness. The whisper grew louder, filling the cab with a sound like wind through dry grass. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The clock ticked over to 2:27 and the air cleared. The whisper faded, replaced by the distant rumble of thunder. I let out a shaky breath, wiping sweat from my brow. The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the static. "Cab 7, you there?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Got a call from the trailer park. Kid says he needs a ride. Sounds urgent." I drove through the empty streets, the storm building overhead. The trailer park was quiet, the only light coming from a single window near the end of the row. A boy stood outside, clutching a backpack to his chest. He climbed in, eyes wide with fear. "Can you take me to my grandma's house, please?" I nodded, glancing at the address he gave me. It was on the far side of town, past the old cemetery. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we drove, the rain began to fall, heavy and relentless. The wipers struggled to keep up, the road slick beneath the tires. The boy sat in silence, his hands trembling. "Are you all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, tears glinting in the dim light. "Something's after me," he whispered. It was outside my window. It kept calling my name. I felt a chill run down my spine, the memory of the whisper in my cab still fresh. I pressed the gas, eager to put distance between us and whatever haunted the night. As we neared the cemetery, the headlights caught a figure standing by the gate. A woman in a white dress, her hair tangled, her eyes fixed on the cab. The boy whimpered, shrinking into the seat. "Don't stop," he pleaded. "Please." I kept driving, the figure vanishing in the rear view as we passed. The rain hammered the roof, the wind howling through the trees. The boy clung to his backpack, eyes squeezed shut. When we reached his grandmother's house, he bolted from the cab, running to the porch. An old woman opened the door, pulling him inside without a word. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and knowing, and nodded once before closing the door. I sat in the cab, heart pounding, the storm raging around me. The radio was silent, the only sound, the rain on the roof and the wind. In the trees, I felt the weight of the rules pressing down on me, a reminder that some things were better left unexplained. The rest of the night passed in a blur of empty streets and distant thunder. I picked up a few more fares. A woman with a suitcase, a man in a cowboy hat, a teenager heading home from a late shift at the grocery store. Each one seemed nervous, their eyes darting to the shadows outside. When dawn finally broke, I drove back to the cab company, the storm fading to a gentle drizzle. Earl was waiting as always, his eyes tired but alert. "How'd it go?" he asked, taking the keys from my shaking hand. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Strange," I said finally. "Felt like something was following me all night." He nodded, lighting a cigarette. "That's how you know you're doing it right. The rules keep you safe, but they don't make it easy." I walked home through the wet streets, the sky pale and washed out. Dustbine felt different in the morning light, the shadows receding, but never truly gone. I thought about the boy, the woman at the cemetery, the coin I'd refused. I wondered how many others had faced the same choices, how many had vanished into the night. As I crawled into bed, the rules echoed in my mind, a litany against the darkness. I knew I'd be back behind the wheel the next night, the Crown Vic waiting. The rules my only shield against whatever watched from the shadows. Story 4. The fourth night in Dustpine brought a different kind of darkness. The wind had died, but the air felt thick, as if the whole town was holding its breath. I walked to the cab company with a sense of dread that clung to my skin, heavier than the Texas humidity. The streets were quieter than usual. Not even the stray dogs or porch sitters were out tonight. Every window I passed was shuttered. Every porch light burned behind curtains as if the whole town had agreed to hide from something only they could sense. Earl was waiting for me as always, but tonight, he didn't hand me the keys right away. He just stared at me for a long moment, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. "You look tired," he said, voice flat. "So do you," I replied, and for a moment we shared a silence that felt like an understanding. He slid the keys across the counter. "You keep following the rules." "I have," I said, but I wasn't sure if it was the truth. The rules had started to feel less like guidelines and more like a thin rope stretched over a bottomless pit. I was clinging to them, but I could feel the rope fraying. Earl hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out a battered folder. "You ever wonder why we have those rules?" he asked. I nodded. "Every night." He pushed the folder toward me. "Read this when you get a chance. Just don't let anyone see you with it, not even the other drivers." I took the folder, tucked it under my arm, and headed out to the Crown Vic. The cab felt colder than usual, the seats stiff and unwelcoming. I set the folder on the passenger seat, promising myself I'd look through it between fares. The first call came just after midnight, a pickup at the edge of town near the old sawmill. The place had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded and its walls tagged with graffiti. A woman waited by the gate, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She climbed in without a word, her hands gloved despite the heat. "Where to?" I asked, but she only pointed straight ahead. We drove in silence, the headlights barely illuminating the cracked road. I tried to focus on the drive, but my mind kept drifting to the folder on the seat beside me. When we reached a crossroads, she tapped the window. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stopped and she stepped out, vanishing into the darkness. I waited for a moment, half expecting her to reappear, but the night swallowed her whole. When I looked back at the seat, there was a single gold coin stamped Dustpine Fare. I left it where it was. Between fares, I opened the folder. Inside were old newspaper clippings yellowed with age and handwritten notes in Earl's blocky script. The headlines told stories I'd never heard. "Local man vanishes after night shift. Mysterious coin linked to disappearances. Crossroads claims another." The notes were worse. Descriptions of passengers who weren't quite right, of drivers who broke the rules and were never seen again, of things seen in rearview mirrors that didn't belong in this world. One note caught my eye. "Never leave the cab running and empty. They can't get in if you're inside. They can't take you if you're moving." I shivered and closed the folder, tucking it under the seat. The radio crackled. "Cab 7, you copy?" I grabbed a mic. "Yeah, I'm here. Pick up at the old church. Guy says he needs a ride to the cemetery." My gut twisted. The old church was a ruin, its steeple collapsed, its windows shattered. I drove out anyway, the rules pressing against my mind like a warning. A man waited by the church steps, dressed in a black suit that looked a century out of date. He climbed in, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Cemetery, please," he said, his voice smooth as oil. We drove in silence, the road winding through fields of tall grass. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, iron and rusted. As we pulled up, he turned to me, his eyes dark and bottomless. "Do you know why this town has so many rules?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to speak. He smiled, showing too many teeth. "Because Dustpine is a doorway, and doors need to be kept closed." He stepped out and disappeared among the gravestones. I waited, heart pounding, until the clock ticked past 2:13. I kept my eyes fixed on the dashboard, refusing to look in the mirror. The rest of the night passed in a blur of empty streets and silent passengers. Every fare felt like a test, every intersection a threat. I started to see patterns in the town, the way the street lights flickered at certain corners, the way the wind always seemed to blow from the east after midnight, the way some houses never had lights on no matter the hour. Between calls, I read more from the folder. Earl's notes grew more frantic as the pages went on. "They come from the fields," one read. "They wear faces, but they're not people. The rules keep them out, but only if you believe." Another, "The coins are invitations. If you take one, you're marked. They'll follow you until you pay the price." I thought about the coins I'd found, the ones I'd left behind. I wondered how many drivers had taken them, thinking they were just tips, and vanished without a trace. Near dawn, I picked up a fare. At the diner, a young woman with hollow eyes and a voice like broken glass. She asked to be taken to the edge of town where the fields met the woods. As we drove, she leaned forward, her breath cold on my neck. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she whispered. I nodded, unable to lie. "They're getting stronger," she said. "The rules are old, but they're not enough anymore. Something's coming." When we reached her stop, she pressed a slip of paper into my hand. "If you want to survive, don't trust the lights, don't trust the coins, and don't trust the man in the black suit. She stepped out and vanished into the tall grass. I unfolded the paper. There was a single word written in shaky handwriting. Run. I drove back to the cab company, the sky just beginning to lighten. Earl was waiting, his face pale and drawn. You read the My hands ached from... I nodded. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. It's not just stories. This town, it's always been like this. The rules are the only thing keeping the door closed, but every year it gets harder. What happens if the door opens? I asked. He looked at me, fear plain in his eyes. Then Dustpine won't be here anymore. None of us will. I left the cab in the lot and walked home through streets that felt emptier than ever. The folder's weight was gone, but its contents pressed against my mind. I thought about the man in the black suit, the coins, the rules. I wondered how much longer they would hold. As I reached my apartment, I saw a gold coin on my doorstep. I stepped over it, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. Story 5. The fifth night arrived with a sky the color of old bruises and a hush that settled over Dustpine like a warning. I barely slept the day before. Every hour was haunted by the folders, stories, and the woman's whispered warning. Don't trust the lights. Don't trust the coins. Don't trust the man in the black suit. The rules felt heavier than ever, not just words, but a lifeline stretched thin over something vast and hungry. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd pack a bag and leave at first light. But when dusk came, I found myself walking the same cracked sidewalk to the cab company, as if the town itself wouldn't let me go. Earl was waiting as always, but tonight he looked smaller, hunched in the doorway with a thermos clutched in his hands. He didn't say anything when I took the keys. He just nodded, eyes hollow, and watched me go. I wondered if he'd be there when I returned, or if the night would finally claim him. The Crown Vic started on the first try, engine rumbling like a tired animal. I set the folder on the passenger seat, the slip of paper with run scrawled across it tucked inside. The radio was silent, the dispatcher gone. For the first time, I realized I didn't know his name, had never seen his face. I wondered if he'd ever existed at all. The streets were emptier than I'd ever seen them. No porch lights, no laughter drifting from the bar, no stray dogs nosing through trash. Even the wind had died, leaving the night thick and stagnant. I drove in circles, meter ticking, headlights sweeping over fields that seemed to press closer. With every mile, just after midnight, the first call came, not over the radio but from the back seat. A voice soft as moth wings, barely more than a breath. Main and Cross, please. I jerked, heart hammering. But the back seat was empty. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and drove to the intersection. The rules screamed in my mind. Don't pick up anyone at the crossroads after midnight. But when I arrived, the intersection was deserted. Only the fields in the dark and the sense that something was watching from just beyond the reach of the headlights. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas, tearing away from the crossroads, the cab shuddering as if something had brushed against it. In the dark, the next fare was a woman standing outside the diner, her dress too thin for the night air, her eyes wide and unblinking. She climbed in without a word, hands folded in her lap. I didn't ask where she was going. I just drove, letting the cab carry us through the empty streets. After a few blocks, she leaned forward, her breath cold on my neck. You've seen them, haven't you? She whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. They're hungry tonight, she said, hungrier than ever. When I looked in the mirror, her seat was empty. Only the faint scent of wildflowers and something sharp like ozone lingered in the air. The clock crept toward to 13, the time I dreaded most. I pulled to the curb, hands shaking, and stared at the dashboard. The rearview mirror loomed above me, a black void threatening to swallow the world. The air in the cab thickened, heavy and cold. I heard my name, whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Voices overlapping, pleading, mocking, promising things I didn't want to hear. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds, refusing to look. The rules were all I had. When the clock finally ticked over to 2:27, the whispers faded, replaced by the soft patter of rain on the windshield. I started the engine, ready to drive until dawn, but the radio crackled to life. A voice I didn't recognize filled the cab. Cab 7, last fare of the night. Cemetery gates. The line went dead. I drove the headlights slicing through the rain, the fields on either side of the road shifting and writhing as if something moved. Beneath the soil, the cemetery gates loomed ahead, iron and rusted, swinging open on hinges that hadn't moved in years. A man waited beneath the arch, his suit black and spotless, his eyes bottomless. He climbed in, folding his hands in his lap. "Drive," he said, voice smooth as oil. I drove, the road winding through fields that felt older than the town itself. The man watched me in the mirror, his gaze cold and hungry. "You know the rules," he said, not a question. I nodded. "Do you know why they exist?" "To keep the door closed," I whispered. He smiled, too many teeth glinting in the dark. "The door is opening. The rules are breaking. You have a choice tonight." He reached into his pocket and held out a coin, gold and heavy, stamped with Dustpine Fair. "Take it," he said, "and you can leave. Walk away, forget this town, forget the rules, or refuse and stay. But know this, if you stay, you'll never leave." "Not really." I stared at the coin, the rules echoing in my mind. "If a passenger pays with a coin stamped Dustpine Fair, refuse and drive away." I shook my head, voice trembling. "I can't." He laughed, the sound echoing through the cab, rattling the windows. "Then you're one of us now." He stepped out at the next crossroads, vanishing into the rain. I watched him go, the coin still glinting. On the seat beside me, I left it where it was. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The cab seemed to drive itself, the streets looping back on themselves, the town folding in around me. Every fare was a shadow, every voice a whisper. The rules pressed in tighter and tighter until I couldn't breathe. When dawn finally broke, I found myself parked outside the cab company, the engine idling, the coin still on the seat. Earl was gone. The building was dark, windows boarded, as if it had never been open at all. I stepped out, the morning air, sharp and cold. The town was silent, every house shuttered, every street empty. I walked home, the coin burning a hole in my mind. When I reached my apartment, I found a slip of paper on the doorstep. "Run," it said, the ink smeared by rain. I packed a bag, heart pounding, and walked to the edge of town. The fields stretched out before me, endless and empty. I started walking, the rules echoing in my mind with every step. Don't pick up anyone at the crossroads after midnight. Don't look in the rear view between 2:13 and 2:27 a.m. Never leave the cab running and empty. If a passenger pays with a coin, stamped Dustpine Fair, refuse and drive away. I walked until my legs gave out, until the sun was high and the town was a distant memory. But when I looked back, Dustpine was still there, waiting, the cab idling at the curb, the coin glinting on the seat. I realized then that I'd never really left. The town had claimed me, the rules binding me tighter than any chain. I was part of Dustpine now, another shadow in the night, another driver following the rules. As the sun set, I found myself walking back, drawn by something I couldn't name. The cab was waiting, engine running, the coin gone from the seat. I climbed in, hand steady, heart hollow. The radio crackled. "Cab 7, first fare of the night." Main and Willow, I drove the streets empty, the night pressing in. The rules were all I had, all I'd ever have. The door was closing, but I was on the wrong side. Somewhere a new driver would come, desperate and tired, clutching the rules. Like a lifeline, the cycle would start again. The night shift never ends, and Dustpine waits.